Inflation, particularly food price inflation, now a major concern for governments and people all over the world. I'm joined now by Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital. And Peter, for a very long time, you've been warning that we are facing a pending inflation problem. Has it begun? Is it here?
Oh, of course it's here. I mean, in the first place that you would expect to see it is in commodities, particular agricultural commodities and precious metals, which I think are the most sensitive commodities to inflation, and that's exactly what we've seen. And this inflation, it's not because of the weather. Politicians always want to blame inflation on other things like the weather or speculators or greedy corporations or labor unions. It's got nothing to do with those factors. It's all because of money supply. It's because of quantitative easing. It's because of stimulus. This is the consequence of what the government has done to try to stimulate the economy by running huge deficits, and the Fed prints money to buy up treasuries. That expands the money supply, that diminishes the value of money. That means prices have to rise, and that's exactly what's happening.
Right. So the other thing that some people would say is causing this inflation is faster economic growth. China just put a GDP report out, 9.8% for the fourth quarter. Is there a link between economic growth and inflation?
Yeah, but it's the opposite. The more economic growth you have, the less inflation, at least if you're measuring it by prices. Because when economies are growing, they're growing their production. They're producing more goods, and that puts downward pressure on prices. It's when you have economies stagnated or contracting, when they're producing fewer goods, that you have upward pressure on prices. No, the real reason you have inflation is because the governments are inflating. Inflation literally means to expand. And what's expanding is the money supply. It's expanding all over the world. And as money loses value, prices have to rise. That is it. The rest of it is government propaganda to divert our attention from the real cause, which is the government. And this is what's happening. We're going to pay for all this government spending through higher prices. So when you go to the gas station and you fill up and you see how expensive it is, when you go to the checkout counter at the supermarket and you see how much it costs you to buy food, the increase is your share of the cost of the stimulus. This is what it's costing you because Barack Obama and Congress are not cutting spending. They're not raising other taxes. So we're paying for government through a debased standard of living and a higher cost of living.
Right. So we've already seen central banks in China and India and Brazil take some steps at least to try to curtail inflation. And Jean-Claude Trichet, president of the ECB, was quoted in the Wall Street Journal this morning as saying the ECB might hike rates. Can policymakers do anything at this point to curtail this inflation, or do we need Ben Bernanke to get on board that train as well and rapidly raise rates here in the U.S.?
Well, that's ultimately what's going to happen in the U.S., but in the meantime, countries like China, it will be ineffective for China to try to control inflation without allowing its currency to rise. If it simply raises rates, that's going to send more dollars to China chasing RMB. It's going to cause the Chinese monetary authorities to have to crank up the printing presses even faster to buy up those dollars. So the only way China can cure its inflation problem is to stop importing it from us, which means they have to depeg, they have to let their currency rise, which I believe will happen. And when that happens, China will start to rein in inflation, but it will unleash an inflationary nightmare here in the United States. You're going to see consumer prices and interest rates skyrocketing because when we're unable to export our inflation to China, we're going to have to literally eat it ourselves. And that's when the Fed is going to be between a rock and a hard place.
So that's a pretty grim scenario you just laid out. What kind of timetable are you talking about just for the first piece of it for China to depeg? Because obviously President Hu Jintao was here last week, and it doesn't seem like China's in any big hurry to depeg their currency.
Well, I'm sure they are in a hurry. They're just trying to figure out how to do it, and they don't want to say what they're going to do. I mean, they're trying to maximize their ability to get rid of some of their dollars. But I'm sure that they want to move as quickly as possible because China now realizes that inflation is the political that inflation is creating discourse. It's creating a mood in the country that is not conducive to what they're trying to achieve. They've been afraid of rocking the boat, and now they realize that the cost of propping up the U.S. dollar and the U.S. economy is greater than the cost of allowing it to collapse. So I think they're going to be moving quicker. And, you know, when President Obama had his press conference with President Hu, and he actually did a pretty good job of explaining to China why the Chinese would benefit from a stronger RMB, that it would bring down their
Right.
prices, that it would cause the Chinese to experience more purchasing power and a rising standard of living. But what he forgets to point out is it's the exact opposite here, because as the Chinese currency increases in strength, the dollar must decrease, and so Americans experience higher prices, falling purchasing power, and a lower standard of living. And that is what's coming, unfortunately.